This video is the second of a two-parter about the exploration of the great steppe and northern regions of Eurasia and North America as done by the two large steppe states of Russia and the United States. The first video will cover the Russian exploration as done by Vitus Bering, as this was earlier than the American and brought the Russians all the way to Alaska. The second video will cover the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific coast of the Oregon Territory following the Louisiana Purchase. Thus, these are the stories of how the Russians and Americans reached the Pacific. In 1803, the US purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, arguably the best land purchase in history, as it covered most of the Mississippi drainage basin and gave the US rights to the interior of the continent. Then President Thomas Jefferson sent his secretary Meriwether Lewis along with Lewis's friend William Clark to map out the area and find a path to the Pacific. They would not succeed in finding an easy route to the Pacific, but they found one nonetheless. The voyage of Lewis and Clark would set out from St. Louis along the Missouri River in May 1804. The direction of the expedition would need to be northwest, as at the time the American Southwest still belonged to Spain. Thus the expedition would go to the Oregon country, which was disputed between Britain and the US. The expedition would therefore also help the American claim to the southern part of the Oregon Territory, today the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Lewis and Clark mainly traveled inland by river, as the easiest way to travel in those days was to cross from river to river across land where they were closest. For traveling on the rivers, Lewis and Clark would use canoes of the same type as the natives. As they traveled along the Missouri, they often experienced parts of the river where it was narrow and rapid, thus they often had to drag the canoes or drive them on primitive wagons. Where the Platte River meets the Missouri, Lewis and Clark met with the Oto tribe at a place called Council Bluff, now a city in Iowa. Council Bluff was an ideal meeting ground for the Sioux, Oto, and Omaha tribes. The Oto offered fur and horses in exchange for weapons to be used against the enemies of the Oto. This highlights the importance of fur trade in many of the expeditions into the interior of North America and Eurasia. The fur trade had also been the backbone of the French presence in North America. Further up the river, Lewis and Clark established Fort Mandan at the tribe by the same name. They spent the winter at the fort, and here they met the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who was married to a local hunter. The pair joined the expedition, and Sacagawea proved invaluable to the expedition as an interpreter and pathfinder. As the expedition reached further up into the Rocky Mountains, the river became increasingly difficult to traverse, and the canoes needed to be carried more and more often, as for instance at Great Falls in Montana. Later at Three Forks, Lewis and Clark determined the Jefferson River to be the best path forward to meeting the Shoshone tribe to gain their assistance in reaching the Columbia River at the other side of the watershed. This proved to be the right decision, and with the help of Sacagawea, they attained Shoshone pathfinders to show them through. The Shoshone pathfinders led them to the Columbia River, where they could paddle downstream in their canoes. In December 1805, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific coast at the mouth of the Columbia River and built Fort Clatsop, where they stayed the winter. They thus succeeded in finding a path to the Pacific, but not an easy path in any sense of the word. This meant that in the spring 1806 they would split up for the return trip to find alternative routes. Lewis would take the northern route across land to Great Falls, while Clark would take the southern back across Three Forks and find a path along the Yellowstone River back to the Missouri. Lewis's route would be the easier given the terrain, but it was inhabited by hostile Blackfoot Indians, some of the few hostile natives met by the expedition. Thus none of the routes were as such easier than the route taken to the Pacific. Lewis and Clark would meet up where the Yellowstone met the Missouri and return to St. Louis together. They accomplished their mission and mapped the northern region of the Louisiana Territory, as well as established the American presence in the Oregon country, which at the time was also visited by both British and Russian fur traders. The expedition did not provide the easy route to the Pacific that Thomas Jefferson had hoped, but it did show a way through for later fur trading mountain men to follow. These would scout out better routes through the mountains in the period between 1810 and 1846. In the end, the actual Oregon Trail would be found by following the Platte River from Council Bluff and across a path to the Snake River leading up to the Columbia. This southern route was much easier than the one traveled by Lewis and Clark and would be improved upon until it could be used by prairie schooner wagons. The immigration to the fertile land west of the mountains started in the mid-1830s. There was some conflict, however, as the British fur trade through the Hudson Bay Company had a strong presence in the area. This was finally settled in 1846 when the Oregon country was split, with the northern half going to Britain as British Columbia, while the lower half went to the US. The British had succeeded in pushing out the Russians, who in 1867 decided to sell Alaska to the US for the same reason. After 1846, the Oregon Trail would begin to be used in earnest, leading to large settlement in the region, thus finishing the groundwork laid by the Lewis and Clark expedition. This made the US a country from coast to coast, so the US established itself as the great steppe nation of North America.